Uh, yeah, I was asked to wait 5 minutes till what you say. So let us proceed now. I have been asked basically to speak on international affairs covering basically four areas, or sorry, three areas. One is world politics. That would cover slightly more political things, and that is something that is very important today, much more than anything to do with military or force or battles and so on. And the second one was really to talk about the United Nations, because that is now once again the only agency that is has membership of almost every country in the world, and that brings people together in one place or two places, depending on the particular agency. And then the third one, of course, on disarmament, which again is more on the military aspects, but that has some other aspects as well. So basically on the world politics, at the present time, after many changes in the last 200 years, we are now living in what people would call a very globalized world. Earlier, countries were separate. There were colonies that were separate. Languages were different and so on. And if you look at Sri Lanka itself, from the old days, when it was using even Sanskrit and Pali and so on, and then got on when the Portuguese came along, and then they took over. After the Dutch and the British. So now we have this situation where English has caught up as a sort of a main language because of the colonial aspects mostly. French and so on are there, but not so much. But now, little by little, there are some changes coming, with Chinese also being studied more, but of course not spread out much. So in any case, what we have is that the communications and the dealings between states are closer and much more easy now. For example, there are easier international linkages, which also help to have some cooperative understandings among countries. At the same time, the more you have that ability to meet people and meet different countries and so on, there is also the hostile rivalry in the current complex international scene, which covers not only political but economics and security issues. Then also the question of travel, now including by air, is no longer a problem. Earlier it took a longer time, and now travel by air and convenience facilitates, helps. At the same time, it also complicates and makes difficulties in terms of international rivalry. And that is the whole question of competition that comes by people trying to outdo the other person. So in that thing, we had, of course, just to go back a little bit, in the past, there were two broad rival political, economic and cultural systems. They were said to be under two ideologies. One was democracy, and that was to show that everybody is going to talk. At the same time, there was also communism. So these two groupings were very strong, and they were to some extent respected by the United States of America and the British in terms of what they call democracy, and the Soviet Union and perhaps up to a point China as being communist. So these two were the things, and so there was this whole idea of having two superpowers. But China was not put into that category because of the thinking that was going on. It was really United States and Soviet Union. And in that situation, this bipolar world, as it was called, was going on. And then there was this policy coming up of non-alignment. Now here also it started off with Yugoslavia, which was a communist country. Its economy was communist in that sense. But at the same time, it was doing very well, and other countries around it were having problems with it. There was rivalry. That is the main thing that you have even today. if you look at commercial aspects, if you have a Thekade built here and it's getting all the public, if the second Thekade is open somewhere else, you will find that there will be competition and one will try to outdo the other. So like that, they were described as the two superpowers, that is the US and Soviet Union. And this was called the bipolar world at that time. But of course, the rest of the world was known as the third world, the leftover people, and many of them were guided by the neutral political economy of non-alignment. It is not aligned to US or not aligned to Soviet Union, not aligned to communism or democracy, but a little bit of both. And it started off really in the 1960s or late 59 in Yugoslavia, headed by its president Joseph Broz Tito. Now that is again because he was very close to the Soviet Union and he was quite anxious to have his own system of government in Yugoslavia, although he was also a communist. So he was the first of the non-aligned countries, though he was a communist, and they had the first non-aligned summit conference in Belgrade, that is in capital of Yugoslavia, in 1961. Now, when this took place, even Sri Lanka, at that time known as Ceylon, was also able, with the British not complaining too much, to go for this meeting. We were of course by that time more or less sort of like independent, because 48 we got independence, but there was still some sort of control, but it was possible to go for these meetings. And then nations who are moving out of colonialism welcomed non-alignment as a philosophy and followed up with it. So many such countries are still under the guidance of capitalism and communism, but they are not tied to either the Soviet Union or to the Chinese or to the Americans. They are now independent, and some of them are fairly strong. And even now, some powerful states use their influence over these developing countries purely to gain some economic benefits. They don't conquer the place. So colonialism is no longer an ideology, but given continuing economic discrepancies between countries, some countries have enough, some countries don't have enough, the economically powerful countries use their influence on smaller independent nations by providing them with some assistance. Sometimes language is the most important thing. The British fellows have all those old colonies, and they provide the independent countries foreign aid, as they call it. But these can be called bribes, and here in Sri Lanka you can call them pagar. They will sort of give these things to stay on. For example, Sri Lanka, the British were very anxious that we didn't get too much of control even by India, which was next door. And then India was big enough almost to cope with themselves alone. And the fact that I am speaking to you in English is also an indication that those linkages go on. But it is of course useful today, because in terms of the languages spoken today, it's about 3 or 4 countries which are supreme. It's English is one, Chinese because of the simple aspect of the big population of Chinese. Russian is not very much popular because it is only Ruskis there, but of course French is also there. So you have English, French, Germany not much again, and of course now Chinese are building up because of their own language, because their population is the largest one. So at the last non-aligned summit, for example, when we had these meetings coming up, we had ours, of course, I'll get back to that later. The last summit was a 17th non-aligned summit, and that was held last September in Venezuela. Now 17 observer countries were also coming to that conference. But what has happened now is non-alignment is not that popular, although it takes place. This is the 17th non-aligned summit. The crowding and so on is not much, because countries have their own linkages. Maybe they speak one language, maybe their country has certain economic groupings, production of certain types. So they have broken off from those fine titles like communism, capitalism and so on. And just to give this idea, way back in our own situation, even as far back as 1976, when the SLFP was coming up, building itself up much more stronger than the UNP, China realized that the location of Sri Lanka was very vital in the middle of the Indian Ocean, because we have had people from China coming in ages ago, two of them very big. Fashian was one. Fashian was a Buddhist monk, and he knew that Sri Lanka had an excellent Buddhist civilization, and he unbelievably came in a ship part of the way up to India, came across India, and then finally came to Sri Lanka, and he was at Abhayagiri Vihara, where he was able to manage to learn some Pali and Sanskrit and to copy the Buddhist scriptures at that time. So that was quite some time back, but that was very important. Then of course the Chinese, what really happened is that in 76, when all these things were happening, China was then really rising, and we were then under the SLFP, and way back at that time the Chinese came to us. I was also at that time just joining into the foreign service and so on, and they asked us whether they could help us, and obviously Mrs. Bandaranayake was able to say, because SWR was not at that time alive at that time, and basically they tried to help us, and the major thing they did was they built the entire Bandaranayake Memorial International Conference Hall. That was supposed to be to remember SWRD, but it was, I think, a major indication of China's importance also, to understand that they saw China, that they saw a very good role for Sri Lanka, mostly because of its location, and secondly also to give Sri Lanka a little more strength as against, for example, India. So the entire BMICH was built up by the Chinese with very little assistance from us. Like even the labor, some of it was coming from China, and this helped our 5th non-aligned summit to host that entire summit, which was very efficient, and a large number of global participants came to Sri Lanka because they had heard of Sri Lanka through various sources, and they liked the climate here and so on, and so all these people came there. I at that time was not all that sort of senior in the foreign ministry, but I was involved as a sort of a working assistant to Ambassador Shirley Amarasinghe, who is no longer with us now, but he was at that time the permanent secretary to the United Nations in New York. So he came into the conference, and he was one of the biggest helpers for Ms. Bandaranayake to get this thing done, because from New York, Shirley Amarasinghe also did a lot of work to get as many people from New York, any countries from New York rather, that is from the UN, to come to Sri Lanka, also showing what Sri Lanka had, that it was an independent country, why don't you come there, and so on. And it was really quite a major conference with a lot of the financing provided by the Chinese, and up to a point even by the US, who felt that Sri Lanka was sufficiently independent and at the same time not sufficiently strong as India was to be able to do something else. So they felt that they might be able to even control Sri Lanka up to a point, and to also give this whole non-aligned meeting a slight quote-unquote democratic or American or whatever it is. So this was a very interesting mix-up of things, and that conference of course did take place, and there I was involved as a working assistant myself to Ambassador Shirley Amarasinghe, who was ambassador in New York. So given the large number of people participating at the summit, the United States was also rather interested to see what was going on in this summit, because one aspect was that Cuba's Fidel Castro also came for the non-aligned summit. So the fact that he came, he was at that time seen by the US as the biggest danger to the US, because it was a communist country close to the US, and whether there was some sort of possibility of those influences coming into the United States as well. So that was very interesting that we had Fidel Castro also at our summit, and that was a very successful non-aligned summit in 1976. And it was again, Mrs. Bandaranaike was also very efficient, and there were others also who were there, who came into the picture. Our economists were brought in, and that way that summit was quite good. So then that was a major aspect of change, which gave Sri Lanka also a certain independent role to be able to manage. And even the Indians, Indira Gandhi also came for the conference, because there was some bit of rivalry earlier between J.R. Jayawardena. By that time J.R. had lost, it was Mrs. Bandaranaike, and she had some problems, because when Jawaharlal Nehru passed away, whatever Indira Gandhi was trying to tell J.R., who used to be immediately bashed off, and I was told by some friends who were there that J.R. used to always tell her that I know your father much more than you knew him, so don't try to tell me what he was. And he was able to keep a certain separateness from the Indian operation. So that was very interesting, and those changes took place. Now, what is rather interesting in the present setup is what can be described as recent political changes in the world, is the presidential election that took place in the US and the victory of His Excellency Donald Trump. Now, for example, Chinese were watching the whole US setup, because now China is the number 2 strongest economy in the world. The US is still number 1. Then Japan was the second strongest economy in the world, but the Chinese have managed to beat the Japanese, and they are number 2 economy. That is in terms of what are its exports, what are its imports, how well are the population looked after. So under that criteria, China is now the number 2 thing. So with Donald Trump coming in, there is now a lot of uncertainty, and the Chinese People's Daily newspaper had a very good article which said, and I quote, "The rise of Donald Trump has plunged, that is pushed, the world into a period of deep uncertainty about the policies and impact of the next US administration," which is true, because even now there is a lot of confusion globally as to what exactly Trump is going to do, and whether he has any trump cards, as it were, like in any card game, which might give him special advantages. Then it's also the People's Daily, once again, I'll leave a copy of the thing, you can get it by photocopy, I suppose, of November 11, did say, and I quote, "Beijing is confident that the world's most important bilateral relationship will remain strong. President Xi Jinping said he hoped," Xi Jinping was the Chinese president, "he hoped they could work together to boost China-US relations." Now that is very interesting, that at this situation, the Chinese also feel that Trump is such a difficult group also to deal with, because nobody seems to know what exactly his real leanings are and where he will take the US. So if you look at the newspapers, if you read a British newspaper, you get 1 or 2 ideas. The Chinese papers will write something else, Indians will write something else. So there is still a great deal of confusion as to what sort of government the United States is going to have. And it's some of the things that he says. And just two days ago, I think I was at the Bimai State watching a live DVD of the takeover by Trump. And it was very interesting, because looking at his face, he looked as if he was totally confused and not sure what to do. And there were his advisors telling him, whispering things to his ear and so on. And he went up to the podium and he spoke. But of course, there was a huge crowd. And if any of you saw at least few of those TV newsreels, it was an enormous number of people mostly US guys, but also from other foreign countries who wanted to get an idea of what exactly the US was going to do, because it is still the largest economy in the world, whether it will sort of open up or not. But those who are firmly supporting, shall we say, capitalism and so on, are certain that Trump will do well, for the simple reason that Trump himself, by himself, with a slight degree of corruption and all the rest of it, has been a very successful businessman. There's a Trump Tower in the US, and even we had a Trump Tower here, some other building that was given the word Trump Tower. So he was by himself quite good, but whether he could really manage a state as large as the United States, with so many different communities and so on, that is going to be a very important thing for even for us to be aware of. Because the US is also now aware of China's political and economic power, having pushed back Japan to number 3. So of course for Sri Lanka at the moment, we have good relations with all 3. And partly due to Sri Lanka's strategic Indian Ocean location, all 3 countries would not want to break up their relationship with Sri Lanka. So ours is a very interesting situation, the Indian Ocean location and our balanced neutral position. Because if you are seen as too much pro-American, then there will be problems with the Chinese, and vice versa. I myself served almost 4 years in China as ambassador, and during that period also, I had several discussions with Americans who would always come to me and ask me, okay, what are you guys up with China? And they would sort of try to figure the rise of China, which has been extremely rapid, and also not following, technically speaking, capitalism in the way it was. The state control of the Chinese economy is very great compared to, shall we say, the United States, where there are so many corporate groups, so many companies, and all which operate into that. So we have a very strange relationship of managing all these things, and I don't know how well we can do this as we go on this thing. Then of course, the next point I'll go on to is to deal with the question of the United Nations Charter and the UN system. So this is basically on the overall situation in terms of the foreign policy and so on. But the UN Charter and the UN system is also something that is becoming a little strong now. Of course, the UN system has been built up, enlarging itself over the years. It provides membership to countries of all political and all economic systems of governance and ideologies. So to that extent, it is one place where all activities are taking place, although of course it is at the moment headquartered in the United States. But the whole operation of the US has a whole number of other groupings and so on, which are spread out all over the world. And each of them is rather specialized. Now here too it's very confusing, because some of the bosses of different what we call these associations in the UN are little more right-wing, others are more left-wing, others are neutral. So it's a mix of a thing there, and it's a sort of a strange situation, and people now talk of the US having the largest economy on the world on the basis of an open, democratic, free system, whereas China serves as a communist country and is the second largest economy in the world. Now here too, earlier Taiwan was given that role, but China, by rising, is one of the 2 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So these 5 are basically accepted as the most powerful and the most influential of all the powers in the world. As you know, these are the United States, China, Britain, Japan, and another thing, or the 5 countries. They also have a better vote, because they have, for example, what is known as a veto, which means that any decision that is taken place by the UN, the veto of one country can stop it. Even if the other 4 oppose it, it can be stopped. So that is system which also developed after the old League of Nations vanished. So the UN also, therefore, and that's why I think they have put this as second most important sub item on the question of the foreign policy and so on. That was actually expected to become the major source of economic management by the US, but the Chinese being there also with the veto powers, and the Soviet Union also with the veto power, there is now a sort of a balance there. And the British and the French also have the vetoes, but it's a sort of a rather interesting sort of setup, because these 5 countries serve permanently in the Security Council, and the other 10 members of the Council serve each only for 5 years at free elections. So it's rather interesting that this whole question of the UN, which was established in October 1945 after the League of Nations. The League of Nations was something like the UN during the World War, but it was unable to control the wars or do anything with that way, and it was knocked out. And it's in that context that the UN itself, the United Nations organization, was set up in 1945, mostly by the West, but also they put in China, because in 1945, Communist China was there, Taiwan was there. It had not come to a point where it was such a danger which could be seen from the white man and from the whole capitalist setup. Then at present the membership of the UN is 194, but it includes virtually every single country. And if you look at our region of the SAARC countries, all the SAARC countries are members of the UN, and each of them has their own permanent mission in New York, and also their embassies, their not embassies or what you call them, their you can call them embassies or officers or whatever. So they have their own permanent membership also there. So they have a good survey of what is going on in international affairs, because there are a whole series of aspects which are looked at by the UN during its full time. And as I said, 194 members, it includes virtually the rich and the poor and everyone. And the UN Charter, which is available on the internet, you can see that it provides fairly efficient means to cover virtually all the global aspects through various agencies it has got. But again, they keep that control of the permanent members of the Security Council, the 5 guys, which are the ones who will sort of have some better control. Then of course the UN General Assembly has altogether supported by five bodies. One is the Security Council, second is the Economic and Social Council, the third is the Trusteeship Council, and the International Court of Justice. So there again, Security Council is the major one that looks at all the political issues, and any big decisions to be made are taken up by the Security Council. Then the Economic and Social Council looks at, of course, all the social and economic issues. Trusteeship Council is mostly looking at the countries which are now sort of were colonies which are quietly breaking down and coming into independent state. So the US and other countries also work through the Trusteeship Council to gain some control into newly emerging countries. And of course, the last one is the International Court of Justice. Now there again, the International Court of Justice is seen as efficient by some, as others know. Looking at international law, the International Court of Justice is okay. But sometimes if an issue comes and you take it up at the International Court of Justice, then it becomes very difficult, because if you have influence in many countries, you might be able to get your own work done. If not, you can do whatever you have. Sri Lanka has gone to the Trusteeship Council, particularly during the times of the JVP and so on, to see if they can get anything, but they have not been working. And also, if we feel that the Indians are pushing us too much on some issues, then again you can take this up at the Trusteeship Council or even at the Security Council and to see if you can break free. So that way those issues are quite strong. Then of course the whole purpose and principles of the UN organization, which was summarized by a think tank as follows. What I will do is I will just read them out quickly. They are in that, all put into that document, you can take it. These are the things that they thought are most important. 1, freedom. 2, equity and solidarity. 3, tolerance. 4, non-violence. 5, respect for nature and the environment. And the last one, shared responsibilities. So these are thought as the main things that will govern international affairs. That is, I'll read them out again. Freedom, equity and solidarity, tolerance, non-violence, respect for nature and the environment, shared responsibility, and human rights. Now each of these is a huge issue and that can be changed and altered. So it's useful because they keep these things at least in some form. And of course the implementation of these principles vary from country to country and also within countries from different parties and so on. And here there is of course the report of the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who was a South Korean. He says he wrote a report called the We the People, the role of the United Nations in the 21st century. Now this is available on the internet, you can check it out. I have just given a few ideas of that, I won't go into details of that. And of course the UN has a large number of what they call specialized agencies, which cover different aspects of economic affairs, political issues, foreign affairs, legal issues and so on. And any UN member can come for the meetings of these particular specialized agencies. And it depends on individual countries how much they accept these different organizations. And now Sri Lanka, for example, is fairly interested in the UN, and it has some of these issues sort of brought up by officers here of the different agencies, not all of them, but there is a UNESCO office, for example, there is a WHO office here. So the UN has people spelled out all over the world, and this tries to keep all these things tied up together. So just to give you a quick, I'll just read it out, but that copy is available for that. The actual agencies are Food and Agriculture Organization. It's quite clear what is involved by that. Then the International Civil Aviation Organization. Now a thing like that is very important, ICAO, because that has certain rulings about the use of airspace by airlines. Because sometimes there are airlines which overuse their areas or go into other areas. So some airlines get their freedom of navigation on the air from this point to that point and so on. And you can't break it. If you break it, they cause problems for others who have airlines. So there are that type of controls which are quite useful, but there again it depends on your diplomats and how specialized they are. So that means we have the International Labour Organization, the International Maritime Organization, that's also to do with shipping and so on. The International Monetary Fund, which is very important, that is the one that determines also things like currency rates and so on, how good is the Sri Lanka rupee as against the dollar and so on. So this comes into that aspect. Then the International Telecommunications Union, that's obvious. And then the UN Education, Scientific, Cultural Organization, UNESCO. Now UNESCO, of course, again is very big in Sri Lanka, and it encourages cultural aspects and so on, and also brings in foreign groups here in the same way that we send our groups and so on to other countries. So there is a cultural aspect there. And then there is also the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, which also controls up to some point. Again, influence can be used. If, for example, Sri Lanka tea is very popular in a particular country, and somebody else is breaking in, Sri Lanka can go to this group and see whether we can manage to control the amount of stuff that they are bringing, or at least control its quality, so that you can stop something which is inferior and interfering with your own products. Then, of course, there is the Universal Postal Union. That's just on how the Postal Union works out with the traffic, postage and trafficking and so on. Then the more important one, the World Bank Group. Now this is very important because this is the one that looks also with currency aspects, plus also foreign aid and so on, working that out. Then intellectual property organization, that's another thing that you can't, for example, if microphones are done by certain countries which can be used 100 yards away and they produce this there, you can't start making the same thing unless you've got a okay to get that particular control done. And then of course the World Tourism Organization, which encourages this huge amount of traveling across the world. And that's the thing about the UN. And the last point that I was asked to talk of is disarmament. And here of course there are a large number of initiatives and resolutions that have been adopted by the United Nations and its many organizations on disarmament and promotion of peace. The first committee of the UN deals with regional and global challenges and security threats. That's the more the political one. At the same time, armaments, nuclear weapons are being projected by individual countries, are being justified for the promotion and protection of peace. Then of course, once again the former UN Secretary General, he made some very significant remarks based on his experiences on the future of multilateral diplomacy. Now that report is also available on the internet. His own country, he said, had, and I quote, experienced ravages of war in 1950 and continues to face threats from nuclear weapons, missiles, ballistic missiles and many other conventional arms. Then he said sometime in 2008 and put out a 5-point plan to revitalize and to change the whole international disarmament agenda. And again, I won't go into details, but the 5 points he made is: first, disarmament must enhance security. That's very important, but I think some countries would need to have a big army to protect themselves from the bigger guy next to you. So then who is going to decide who is justified in keeping the arms? Then it must be reliably verified. That's another difficult thing today, because you have to have a committee which will then see, say between India and Pakistan, there are huge problems of the movement of arms and which areas are controlled by which. So those are things that have to be done. And that disarmament must be rooted in legal obligations, that you are not expected to use your armed forces to attack others. Defend, yes, but then how do you define attack? How do you define defense? This is the biggest problem that has crept into India and Pakistan. And right now, in fact, India is trying to prevent Pakistan from being one of the 5 members of a certain group as well. And then disarmament must be visible to the general public and be clearly seen as helpful. So not to make it again something which will be useful for the big guys and not for the small guys. And the last point 5, disarmament must be able to anticipate emerging dangers even from conventional weapons. They have very strong things on nuclear weapons, but even ordinary weapons are a bit of a problem at times. Then of course, just last year, building on these 5 points which he made clear in 2008, he made again 4 points. Even I have not gone through them in detail. It's very recent. It was in November last year, I think. First, he said that the elimination of nuclear weapons is an existing threat to humanity, that he has to knock out all the nuclear weapons. Use nuclear energy for electricity, for driving things, water, whatever is all right, but not for warfare. Then beyond nuclear disarmament, we need to strive for the universality of instruments aimed at halting the growing risk of terrorism using chemical, biological radiological or nuclear material. So here again this use of terrorism where these items are being used, and this also applies to obviously states. Then 3, the Security Council must fulfill its responsibilities for the maintenance of international peace and security by addressing real present dangers posed by weapons of mass destruction. That is the bigger ones. And the last one, of course, these are very general ones as usual from the UN. The 4th one, it says the international community must embrace the humanitarian, human rights, social and economic imperatives for disarmament and arms regulation, building on our process, outlawing inhuman weapons and adopting the Arms Trade Treaty. So these are all the things which I thought I just put on to for your use on all these things. The 5th one was more assistance should be provided to widen the emerging technologies, new ones, and deal effectively with potentially destabilizing military applications, including armed drones. These are which operate without any pilot or anything, cyber weapons, space weapons, biological weapons made through genetic engineering. Now these are very dangerous ones. This is where they use different types of poisons into things which can, for example, affect your heart and so on when they are used as a bomb. Then of course strategic missile defense capacities and a whole lot of other things on which they worked out. Then the list given to me was also asked me to speak on the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. This is of course a very important treaty with the objective, and I quote, to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and nuclear technology, and instead to further the goal of achieving nuclear disarmament and even general complete disarmament. Again, very high flown stuff, but very impractical and not being done. But the treaty came to force in 1970 and it was extended in 1995 indefinitely. 191 states have joined the treaty, also the 5 nuclear powers, but that is just a piece of paper. And the treaty establishes various things like safeguards and various things. I won't go into that, but the statement I made, I have just put these things down. I will leave the copy of it which can be then spread out. You can use that, and I will now welcome any questions that you may wish to raise. I think we finish up at 6:15. I didn't know. It's I was not quite sure. No, we started a bit late. That's what happened. We were going to finish up at 6. So I'll welcome any questions that you may have to throw, and this will of course be available. This will give you some of the background knowledge. So please go ahead if you have any questions. One thing about Sri Lanka, though it's a small country, it has a fairly good impact still on the UN, mostly also because of Shirley Amarasinghe, who was Secretary General. He was Secretary to the Treasury in Sri Lanka, and then he went to the UN, and he was our permanent representative, and he became chairman of one of the UN sessions where he really did some very good work on nuclear disarmament and things like that. He of course passed away, and now we have every 5 years a new PR coming in. I worked with Shirley Amarasinghe on the online summit in Colombo, which was also rather interesting because we had even people like Fidel Castro coming in here, and to cope with all that was quite a big issue, which we managed to do. There again, as I told you, the Chinese, they didn't come to affect the substance of the document, but their BMICH was one of the things that helped us most. And then the Japanese provided cars and various things for the visitors. So all these things was very important when Sri Lanka as a small country got involved in some of these international issues. I think our timing was supposed to be 5 to 6:15, I think, right? I was not sure. Yes, any questions? No? Can you give just 5 minutes if you have any questions? What will be after that? And give a copy of this ESA that is available in the police. I was told to reach at by 6:50. That's the brief also depending on questions. You can pose the questions in any language. So, the grammar was not very much. Sorry, actually they said from 6 to 7 p.m. you started to do it. So, what is the time that was given to you for the lecture? 5 to 6 hours. Very system. Yeah, that's a very email that came to me was from 5 to 7. Yes, but now
how is going to be the world politics with the new US president?
and that is one of the biggest issues that everybody is going on that. And there, of course, the point is that there is one point which people have missed out, is that his whole setup, he is a great economist, but the methods that he uses are, of course, not the world's most honest and all the rest of it, because these Trump towers, there are several of them, and even there's one in Sri Lanka, some building apparently for a short time they called it Trump Tower. But that is there. He had an international push like that. And the Chinese, who are also very, very practical, as I quoted from the last People's Daily of about 2 or 3 days ago, was saying that they were trying to work out some means of dealing with Trump without clashing with him. But at the same time, within the United States, of course, there are lots of problems. I watched on TV the whole his opening speech and so on. He also was not absolutely confident of how he is going to cope, and he's got different advisors from different areas. So no one can be really sure. Everyone is just watching. Of course, some of the things that are going to be very tricky is that the large number of illegal immigrants or others who have been brought into the United States for cheap labor, a lot of them from Latin America and from South America. Now there are a whole lot of companies which don't want them. Others, and also the human rights people, feel that Americans workers are losing their jobs to these chaps who are immigrants because they work cheaper than what an American would do. These are not the high level ones, but at the low level labor levels and so on. Something of what we had actually at one point in Sri Lanka, when from South India we were importing large numbers of laborers which were working cheaper than what our locals were. In Sri Lanka, it was mostly in the tea industry, for example, where they imported women mostly from Tamil Nadu, who were tea pluckers, who worked harder than some of our women did. So like that, there is this aspect, and of course work cheaper, because the labour's rates that were given to them were much cheaper than what Sri Lankan women wanted for being a tea plucker. So those issues are still there. It's very difficult, and I think everybody is just watching how he is going to cope. And he himself, his personality is such that he has been involved in quite a lot of amounting almost to murders, but trying very subtle means of getting these things done. So how he is going to fare in the next few months will be, I think, Obama, of course, understood some of these, and he also sort of helped to some extent in trying to change some of his policies, change policies of Trump. How they have been changed, I don't know, and it's still too early to judge how exactly the economy is going to work. And that is going to be important because US is still number one, and it can affect not only the United States economy, but all the economies eventually around the world as well. I don't know how many of you have watched Trump's speeches and so on. It's also rather interesting. It's a different style altogether, and I don't know how he is getting involved in them. He has certainly been involved in certain criminal activities also, not only on abusing of labor things, but other aspects as well. So these are, whether they're going to come up in public or they'll be ignored, I don't know, because he has been technically voted in as the President of the United States. So whether that's it, we can't have a real clear idea of that. Because in terms of numbers of votes, perhaps he has lost in terms of actual votes cast, because these are done on the basis of territories and so on. So he has had more that way. So there are all these aspects that are, right now they have been sort of echoed quite a lot in the British press and the American press particularly. The New York Times, for example, dislikes him intensely. So it has the most negative reports still of their own president, whereas the British are a little more sort of trying to explain that these are the matters that he is looking after and that might help. So it's very difficult to judge this. We'll have to see how it comes in at a certain stage. This happened up to a point even in Sri Lanka under Premadasa, where there were a number of people who didn't like his methods of economic development. Others liked it. So like that, these are things which are going to be, though it's a democracy and that they have voted like we did, the actual aspects of support that each of them has, as they develop their economic policies, is going to make some impact. So whether he will do his full 5 years is not sure. At the same time, he is going to use the forces much more. So maybe that will be a strong aspect. So things like that will take time for people to really understand. I have not been able to fully judge the thing because there's a changing report almost every day. Particularly if you look at the Access and New York Times, you see the differences in that.
Don't you think that we will have to take a program regarding the labor if this government has signed the extra agreement with India?
Sorry, extra.
Sorry?
Sorry. Labour, I didn't hear the last one, right?
This government has signed the agreement with India.
Yeah.
And we also have to pay the same for the what is your idea?
Yeah, that's the other point, because in terms of now we are signing agreements with the US, India, and I think with China also. Each of those things, they help the economy, but at the same time, it has some problems for our own labor. We tend to lose out, like very much like the tea estates and so on. Whereas lots of the people in that Candian area, Nor area, and so on, they lost their jobs. So similarly, even here, we are not quite sure whether, particular agreements with India, whether it will mean. Now one of the problems we have is with India is fisheries. Now we have not been wanting to be too tight, but the moment you say something strong about the abusers of fisheries by Indian fishermen who come in, and now little by little, now even right now I think there is a conference going on looking at those things. A few small things are done, but nothing much. For example, deep trawling, where they have Indians come in right into our waters, and they put their thing very deep and just take it out like this, and then empty it. I have seen a video of it, and they empty it onto their boat. Now that includes small fish. Now they throw them back into the sea, they probably die. So in a sense, the actually fishery stocks are being stopped or reduced by that type of fishing. So it depends on how you do your fishing. You do it carefully, safely, or whether you are causing problems to the eventual fish supplies of Sri Lanka. So like that, we'll have these problems, I think, quite a lot with India. We are balancing it out. When this agreement comes in, I don't know how it's going to work out. And it also became a problem with Tamil Nadu, because with Jayalalitha also there were lots of difficulties dealing with this issue, because her votes also depended very much on the fishing community of Tamil Nadu. So like that, the political aspects are still there, and we will have to deal with those as well, including Chinese, because I know there are certain Chinese laborers which come here for road construction and so on, and some companies, there has been a lot of complaints. First, because they work harder and longer than some of the Sinhalese or Tamil workers, even for road construction. So that is part of, it is part of Chinese economic sort of assistance is okay. But if it's a commercial thing, then once again we'll find that some of our labor will lose their jobs if people come in and then do their work here. And there was also a very interesting case recently somewhere in Mannar, where the police had caught some people who were like beggars, even doing some pickpocketing, and they found that 3 of them were Chinese. So they were really confused as to what to do. It was, of course, the Chinese embassy was very good there; they took them away straight away. But that type of thing also happens, because if they use easier methods of economic development, it also makes it more difficult for our chaps, who may be taking a longer time to build a road than, say, the Chinese. When you are finished very early, I give it to you and tell you to decide whether you would like to stay a bit longer and throw questions, or you would like to, maybe I spoke was too fast, but in case a copy of this I will leave with the secretary here, and then it's true that will have all the issues lined up for you now to understand. give you another, say, 10 minutes till 6:30 or so, although we got 5:37. Don't have anything, so you can call it there at 6:30. Any other aspects you would like to have on discussion of particular China-Sri Lanka relations? Can we go into that much detail is there in this month? Right now, that is becoming also very important for the rest of the world. Also, it's going to be a specific thing. Are there any aspects of what I said which I didn't clarify too well or maybe explain too well in such a provide more information on those?
Do you think this non-alignment, approach helps the, balance the, world politics?
Well, alignment is certainly important also, but at the same time, it does not sort of change the entire picture. But I think lots of countries use non-alignment by seeing what discussions take place. If you see in all the online meetings, I put them down in that paper. All the big countries come as observers, including the United States, also here in Colombo as well. But of course, like in all other groups like that, the observers come only for the general debate and so on. For the more private sessions, the drafting sessions and so on, they kept away. But still, the US has been going into all these things, and even the online meeting here, they were there. Chinese are also here as observers. They listen to the speeches of all the foreign ministers and so on, which are in any case very public. But they get some feeling, and also there is a fair amount of informal discussions and conversations that take place also. Because lots of people don't have a chance of meeting, shall we say, the Americans. So if there are certain European countries which want to have a quick chat, they might be able to do it. So this is part of the informal aspects of all conferences, not only the non-aligned ones or Sri Lankan or any other sort of local ones, but even in some of the Western conferences that they have, the observers can sort of be there, and then the Chinese also have a lot of observers at their meetings, and they leave time, coffee breaks and so on, where you can meet some countries and do it, because particularly not now, but earlier when China was not all that powerful, Taiwan was also big, a lot of countries did have those linkages with the People's Republic of China through these informal encounters, and little by little they were able to sort of build up their strength through that. And there is the Shanghai Cooperation conferences that take place. I have been going to several of them. There too, a lot of Americans come as observers. They listen to all the statements that are made, and very often they are seen chatting with some of the people who are participating in that. But now I think the Shanghai Cooperation House is now inviting Americans also to be equal to all the others who have been there, which means that there is some sort of informal discussions, much more than at a UN meeting, for example, where you can, without getting into any complications, check some private issues that you have with individual countries on a one-to-one basis. So that works out quite well, I think. It's something like what we have in Sri Lanka also, these cabinet meetings, and what are the discussions that take place in Parliament outside that. There are people who sort of work out deals privately, which they can't do in public and through these meetings. Is there any other issue that you would like to take up, not necessarily on this particular theme, but on foreign relations and so on, and subsequent meetings? Because there are views, but of course, here the point is that it is, of course, a system of engineers, which is slightly different to purely a political sort of setup. But even in terms of construction and things like that, there's a whole lot of matters that can be discussed. Because in some of the meetings in New York and so on, the corporate areas also are covered through various construction people, technological people and so on, who are able to informally discuss these things and get a feeling of what they can do for bilateral relations with country X, provide them with whatever crockery or what they getting bulbs. All that type of thing is also something that the Chinese do quite a lot. In some of the meetings that they have, including here, which they all operate outside countries as well as in places like Shanghai. But it's a matter of time before they become number one economy. So another thing that's making them US particularly knows that is what government one time it is. There are Western think groups which are doing a lot of study on this and looking at what has been sold and who has been the manufacturer of them. They are working out their own theories, and they are making those predictions that China will be the US economy within the next 10 or 15 years, depending on what research they have done. Okay, it's okay by you, and there's something else that we call it today, or would like to spend a little more time. Yeah, can you want your one-to-one quick discussion? No problem. Oh, thank you.